you so much, Justine Dodds from the Respect Young People's program, for joining us today. My first question to you would be, what is child and adolescent to parent violence and abuse? What are its causes, and how does it relate to domestic violence and abuse? So we can take that one after the other. So what is CAPVA for short?
Okay, so CAPVA is the term that Respect and some other agencies now use to describe child, adolescent to parent violence and abuse. And I suppose the important thing to think about is it's not just a one-off incident of a child having, a difficult time or a temper tantrum. It tends to be a pattern of behaviours. Usually the important thing is that the parent is frightened in some way of the child, or is being controlled by the child, and their behaviour is changing as a result of the child's actions. And it basically covers, the whole gambit of domestic abuse type behaviours. We see things from emotional abuse, physical, violence, damage of property is really quite common in this dynamic. So you'll see, holes in walls and things being smashed and all of that kind of stuff. And also financial abuse. It's really often, when we look at the caseloads, cannabis use is quite strongly linked, and so children will be using abusive and coercive behaviour to try and get money from parents in order to get things like cannabis. That's a really common thing. And I suppose, thinking about the child and adult dynamic, it's not necessarily just children, and it's definitely not just adolescents. That's an important thing to say. So in the past, in the UK, they were calling it APVA, adolescent to parent violence and abuse, and we thought it was really important to add in the child there, because actually we know that it starts way before adolescence often, and sometimes really quite shockingly young ages. And we also know that from the very limited data there is, that it doesn't stop when children become adults always. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. And so we'll see adult children using some of these behaviours as well, and the risk really increasing when it's adult children towards parents and maybe elder parents as well. So it kind of then starts to move into what people are terming elder abuse. So I think, those are the important things to think about in terms of CAPVA.
So it's more family dynamics rather than a certain point in a person's life or in a family's life,
Definitely. I think when we first started to try and define it, it was important to put an age range in there. So we started with the age range of about 8 to 18, because that's where we were looking at the Respect Young People's program. We were looking in terms of where we would pitch that. But actually, when we're starting to think about it in more detail now, it's actually really important to recognize that it doesn't have there isn't a really easy cut-off point. I think children start to come more to the attention of police when they're in adolescence, because parents become more scared, and children are bigger, especially boys. They can become very big very quickly in that adolescent period, and that I think increases the level of fear that victims feel, and their inability to manage the situation without police intervention. So yeah, it's really important to start thinking about that. And there's so little, there's not a lot of research anyway on CAPVA, but there's so little research on adults who are still in this dynamic towards their parents. So yeah, it's more about the dynamic and the relationships than the age range. And in terms of causes, I suppose there's a whole myriad of causes. And when I was talking,
there usually is.
Yeah, always a good social problem always has a lot of causes, doesn't it? And I explained an ecological model in the keynote that we did. That really looks at, the individual factors, and they can be things like, the child's maybe got some kind of neurodivergence, like autistic spectrum condition, or attention deficit disorder is quite common with CAPVA, or it could be, you know, trauma, previous traumatic experiences like domestic abuse, or maybe, you know, having been grown up in a home where parents got a mental health condition or something like that. Those issues all contribute, but then so does the family dynamic that sits around that individual. It might be that there's domestic violence going on in the home, or maybe there has been, and the power dynamics are all messed up. And further around from that family is the community, and maybe there are community issues, and so social deprivation, or, you know, gang culture, or all those kind of things, and wider still, you know, the societal impact of, you know, the violence against women and girls generally, and those societal things around masculinity and femininity, and all of that kind of stuff. So it's a whole host of reasons. But with particular reference to domestic abuse, there are a lot of intersecting reasons as to why domestic abuse quite commonly tends to be in the background of CAPVA. And in the Respect Young People's programme data, looking at the caseloads and things like that, we see about 2/3 of the group do have some domestic abuse in the background. And partly that's because of the fact that growing up in a domestic abuse environment is a traumatic experience. And if you've grown up in that and you before, you know, from maybe 5 months in utero to 3 years, your whole fight or flight system is being developed. And if it's being developed in, you know, a really scary environment, you're going to end up with a really oversensitive fight or flight system that responds to danger when maybe there isn't any, or it sees negative responses in other people's facial reactions and things like that. And so you end up with a child like Vessel van der Kolk calls the overactive smoke alarm. So the child is kind of, you know, always on high alert, hyper vigilant, ready to, you know, respond with fight or flight, depending on whether they, you know, think the situation is dangerous or not, which tends to happen quite a lot for those kids. And the other thing is that, you know, domestic abuse really hugely messes up the dynamics in the family. And so if you've got, you know, two parents who should be in kind of equal power over a child, trying to keep them safe, those parents could be male or female, two males, two females, it doesn't really matter. But if one of those parents is, you know, taking all of the power in the family away from the other parent via domestic abuse, and undermining that parent, and, you know, basically making sure that that parent doesn't have a equal footing and equal say in the family, then you end up with a situation in which the child really starts to see that that parent is less than the other one, and really starts to potentially see that even in some situations that they maybe have more power than the non-abusive parent, and in situations where the maybe abusive parent removes themselves, or the split up, you end up with a real power vacuum in that family, where the child has learned not to maybe trust mum, maybe in this case, who's being abused, and has been told maybe directly that she's not to be trusted, and she's not in charge, and she doesn't know, you know, and all of those kind of things. And maybe the child has been placed as well in a position of, you know, checking up on mum, or checking up on the abused parent, whatever the gender is, and maybe being placed in a you know, situation in which their power is elevated. Then when the abusive parent is, you know, no longer in the home, that child can really easily step up and take power. And actually, you know, if the other person who's remaining doesn't feel like they can, or they've been disempowered, then nobody's in charge. That child's going to get really anxious and frightened about that, and maybe then, you know, will step up into that place because somebody needs to be in charge, and they've been in this dynamic where, you know, the non-abusive person is not the right one to be in charge. And so when we get involved with CAPVA cases, trying to restore that power dynamic so that, you know, whoever the person is that's still there can, you know, really be in charge again, and have the appropriate amount of power and control over the child in order to keep them safe and to keep the family safe. So yeah, and, you know, domestic abuse has Lots of other reasons why CAPVA could happen. Attachment can be very difficult. Often perpetrators don't allow parents to respond to children's needs, and so the attachment might be broken. You've got all of that stuff around social learning as well, where the child learns that maybe using violence or abuse is effective means of getting what you want and stuff. So yeah, for lots of reasons, domestic abuse features quite heavily, I think, in the CAPVA caseloads we see.
I was sort of wondering about the term of child and adolescent to parent violence and abuse, because in my understanding of violence and abuse, there's really this will to harm the other person, and it's very much this conscious decision and this act of a controlled act of destruction, that's very much tied to, perpetrators having to be accountable and taking responsibility for their actions. And I feel it's a little bit difficult using those terms on actual children and adolescents, isn't it?
So I think often the violence and abuse can be instrumental, and so there is that kind of, yeah, if I do this, this works, and that's effective. But often, because of the fight or flight thing that's happening with children, they're just children who really struggle to manage their emotions. And we know that children anyway, developmentally don't have the same, mechanisms in terms of executive functioning in the front of their brain in order to control some of the impulses that adults have. And so we, really would steer away from using terms like perpetrator and things like that, because it's a different dynamic for children. And, while we accept that, their anger can make them behave in ways so that isn't, it isn't what we want, and it is abuse. And we are very clear that, what is and what isn't abuse, because it's important for children to know that there is still that, understanding that children are, just developmentally not quite ready yet to be able to take full responsibility in the way that we'd expect adults to. We encourage responsibility, and we encourage them to, say, yes, that's abuse and that isn't. We name it, but it is slightly different, because you're dealing with children who, even any child, really, a teenager, they're still working through that stuff in terms of, being able to have full control over emotions and things like that. If I remember back, I don't think I was abusive as a child, but I definitely didn't manage situations the way I do now.
Who did?
Yeah, exactly. And so sometimes we'll do that kind of exercise with people in group work and things like that, to get them to think about the word they would use to describe themselves as a teenager, because it's a stage, and we move through that stage, hopefully, and we become somebody different.
Thankfully.
Thankfully we become somebody different, somebody who's more in control of their emotions and more able to have that cognitive control over things, rather than allowing things to happen on impulse and stuff. So it is a really difficult thing. But yeah, we do need to acknowledge that children just don't yet have the cognitive ability to do a lot of things that we expect from adults. But still, they need to take responsibility and know that abuse is abuse.
What are some key indicators that practitioners can use to gauge whether they have a case of CAPVA in front of them?
Yeah, so it's difficult, because a lot of the key indicators could be key indicators of other things, like domestic abuse in the family. Anyway, but I think if you start to think about it in terms of like the key indicators, if you were working with the parent, if you've got a parent with unexplained injuries or there's damage around the home, that could be an indicator. Again, it could be an indicator of domestic abuse if they've got a partner, but it could definitely, and I think we need to get our minds around this, it could definitely be an indicator that the child is being violent. It's not a question that we ask, and I think that's a really important thing. Like, are you frightened of your child, is a question that people don't tend to ask, but if you've got indicators, ask the question. Another thing I think with parents particularly, if they don't want the child to know that they've come for support, or they're not willing to talk in front of a child about accessing support or seeking help in any way, shape or form, whether that's just early help or whatever, that's an indication that maybe there's something going on there, that maybe they're frightened of the child. And also, I think signs of financial abuse, if you know the family are really struggling financially, but the child has expensive items, or mum's given the last of the money to the child, that's an indicator that you've got something going on potentially there that you might want to explore a bit more. Again, expensive items could be, it could be signs of exploitation from outside the family, but do consider that potentially it could be this dynamic. And I suppose from the child's point of view, if the practitioner is working with the child, things like school refusal are really closely linked with CAPVA. We see a lot of school anxiety. The children, because they're using, their template with their parents as a template for other relationships, they have real difficulty with their relationships in school. They don't tend to get on very well with other kids, or so they might bully other children, but also just as often they might be bullied by other children because they don't fit in. So that's a key indicator, I would say, as well, in terms of mental health, children with high anxiety. We did some looking at caseloads in 2021 in the Respect programme, and high levels of anxiety, like real issues with self-perception and self-worth, really feeling that they're not loved or they're not lovable, really down on themselves kind of kids. And like I say, high levels of anxiety are all key signs. Unfortunately, there seems to be much more a big strong link with higher levels of mental health issues, and also things like self-harm. And the third thing I would say for children is, is the child involved in criminal exploitation? Is the child involved in sexual exploitation? Or do you have indicators that those things might be happening? Because we do see a big link between CAPVA and those issues. And I suppose it stands to reason, really, if you're not a part of your family in the same ways you would like to be, and you feel like you're the one left out, and the one that's not loved, and all of that kind of stuff. And you can understand why that happens. It's the child's behavior that, creates that dynamic in some ways, but then, it's their family circumstance that's created that behavior. So we're not blaming the child necessarily. But if that's going on in your family and you don't feel part of that family, you're more vulnerable to people grooming you to be a part of an alternative family, and so things like criminal exploitation and sexual exploitation, we know, are high with this caseload. Interestingly, we've got a project that runs in Cambridge in the south of England, and they've just published some data that they got from a really small sample of 15. And 14 of those cases was 100% reduction in police call-outs in the family, and 92% reduction for one family, but that family had 66 call-outs beforehand. But the interesting thing in terms of missing and exploited children was that they had 3 children in that caseload who were on the multi-agency forum, so really quite high risk in terms of missing and exploited. And since intervention started on the Respect programme, they've had no missing incidents. So it shows that there's some kind of link there. We need to explore that further, but there's definitely seems to be an impact from working on the CAPVA in these cases anyway, that's reduced those missing episodes. So yeah, there's definitely those things seem.
Just a clarification on the jargon. Missing episodes means that the child went missing,
and parents reported them missing to the child.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's definitely, we know that that's quite linked, and now it seems like from looking at the data in that study that seems to confirm that there is some kind of link there. We just need to explore that a bit more. I think it works in 2 ways. Like I said, you look for an alternative family if you don't feel part of a family, and people can exploit that. And also, if you're experiencing exploitation outside of the home, you're really struggling to manage that emotionally, you might take those feelings into the home and behave violently, abusively towards people who are safer to be expressing that stuff too. So yeah, I would say, but there's always a whole host of indicators, isn't there? But those are the ones that I thought might be quite interesting for people to think about. In terms of the financial, abuse. Think about things like locks on doors as well in houses. You know, if practitioners are going into homes and they're seeing that the bedroom door's locked, or there's locks in the cupboards in the kitchen and things like that, it might be that parents are trying to protect valuables and things like that. So that's another indicator.
So working with mainly perpetrators of domestic violence, are there any indicators that might be useful for them as well? So if there's, let's say, one of the parents is abusive in the home and the program is working with that parent, something that might shine up as a red flag in the narrative of that parent about their child, or something along those lines.
So I think, you know, but it's difficult because the person who's usually takes the brunt of the behavior is the non-abusive parent, because and this we had some quotes from this, I think, in the briefing, not the keynote but something else, where children were kind of saying, you know, they would never be violent or abusive to the perpetrator, because that's a really unsafe thing to do. But I suppose the adult perpetrator might have a particular favorite child, or a child who they feel particularly is following in their footsteps, kind of thing, or they feel like they're, you know, particularly proud of that child. That might be an indicator that the child is doing things that the parent approves of, or even just mentioning, you know, that the mother can't handle that child, or, you know, they don't have the right way with that child, or whatever. That can be an indicator, I think, of maybe that dynamic going on. Most of my intervention is with the person who's left holding the pieces, unfortunately. But we know that often when we're trying to do that intervention, the adult perpetrator will try and undermine the non-abusive parent, and will maybe you know, stop consequences when the child comes to the home, will interrupt like contact and things like that, and change things around. Will often, you know, still be kind of undermining and alienating from afar. Will tell the child that, you know, whatever mum or the non-abusive parent says doesn't go, or isn't right, or they don't have to listen to it when they're at their home. And so when we're trying to do family agreement work, we often try and get some consistency between the two. And you might see that the adult perpetrator is doing things like letting the children stay up all night, or letting them play on their computer games a lot, all of that kind of stuff. Just ways to kind of make them the more favored parent, and all of that kind of stuff. Those kind of things can be indicators. But any kind of, I think, down talk and mum's ability to manage the children, or just saying that she's got no control over them, or that they don't listen to her and things like that, might be an indicator that you've got some problems with CAPVA.
But I would imagine that there's what you were mentioning before, that there's so little will from the side of the parents, for obvious reasons, to call the police on their own children. Also, maybe having to admit that they can't handle the situation because it's gotten out of hand. So I would imagine there's a lot of like groundwork, sort of awareness raising that needs to happen. Do you know if there's any plans around that, beyond obviously having articles in the Guardians, which is awesome? I wish we had some articles in the Guardian.
You know, you're right. The fact that parents can't come forward is a big problem. And for, you know, families where children are from disadvantaged backgrounds or minoritized backgrounds, that's even more of a problem, because they're worried about the impact of calling the police, and that they may be treated even more detrimentally. So these are things that we've recommended in the literature review, and
which I'll link to. I'll make sure.
Yeah, do, yeah. And whenever I get a chance to kind of talk to people about it, we're always kind of promoting this. I know that we did some an interview with the travelers movement around this, and spoke about this very issue. So yeah, we're just wherever people will listen, we will talk about CAPVA and about the need to really make parents feel understood and validated and empowered to talk about the thing, and to really get rid of the, as much as we can, this feeling of shame and stigma that parents have that prevent them coming forward and seeking support. And in the meantime, we'll just train practitioners wherever we can to respond to that and build the evidence base, and report on that impact, and try and push things forward like that. But it would be, yeah, so much easier if it was done in a less piecemeal fashion than it is at the moment, because it definitely depends on funding, and which areas have got the money to push it forward. So
Thank you so much for sitting down and talking to me. And thank you for all of the amazing work that you and Respect do.
you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.